A quiet farm, a strange discovery, one choice that changed everything. Beneath an old tree stump, Jonathan Miller found something that would awaken the land itself. Watch till the end to uncover the truth behind Miller Creek Farm. The morning light spilled softly over Miller Creek Farm, the mist still clinging to the grass like a reluctant dream. Jonathan Miller stood by the fence, his calloused hands resting on the sun-bleached rail, the damp scent of soil and moss thick in the air. The land stretched before him, tired, familiar, and silent. It was the same view he had known his whole life, yet that morning it felt different, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. 10 years had passed since his father's death, and in that decade Jonathan had watched the farm grow quieter, lonelier. The paint peeled from the farmhouse, the windmill rusted by the pond, and the fields no longer yielded as they once had. Yet he stayed, because leaving would mean admitting that everything his father built, the sweat, the pride, the promise, had ended with him. The day began as it always did. He finished his coffee, fed the livestock, checked the fences. But when the sun climbed higher and the heat began to settle thick on his neck, he turned his eyes toward the far end of the property. Beyond the pond, past the old oaks tangled in Spanish moss, lay a strip of land he hadn't touched in years. His father had once warned him to leave that side alone, said the ground was soft, the water treacherous, the kind of place that swallowed things whole. Jonathan had always dismissed it as superstition, but that morning, for reasons he couldn't name, he decided to clear it. Maybe it was practicality. More land meant more planting. Or maybe it was the restless whisper of something deeper, something that stirred in the silence of that far-off patch. By midday, he had the old tractor rumbling through the grass, its wheels crunching over roots and fallen limbs. The air shimmered with heat, the sky washed white. He worked slowly, cutting through the overgrowth, pausing only to wipe the sweat from his brow. The land smelled of rot and rain. Beneath the hum of the engine, he could hear the faint chorus of frogs and insects rising from the swamp. It was when he reached the old oak stump that the day shifted. The tree had been dead for as long as he could remember, a hollowed monument surrounded by wild ferns. The ground around it looked darker, wetter, as though it had been disturbed. When his shovel struck the earth beside the stump, it made a sound that wasn't right, a muted, heavy thud. He knelt, brushing the soil away with his hands. What he uncovered didn't make sense. Nestled beneath a thin layer of roots was a cluster of pale, leathery shapes, oval, smooth, and faintly warm to the touch. At first, he thought they were rocks, but when he pressed a finger against one, it gave slightly, as if something inside responded. Eggs, big ones, too big for any bird, too soft for a reptile he recognized. He'd seen turtle nests before. These weren't the same. The shells looked almost alive, their surface pulsing faintly in the sunlight. Jonathan's chest tightened. The clearing felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. He stood and looked around, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved except the wind rippling the pond. For the first time in years, he felt like a trespasser on his own land. He thought about smashing them, just in case they were dangerous, but the thought of destroying something he didn't understand made his hand freeze. His father's voice echoed from memory, rough and certain. Never kill what you don't understand. Nature has her reasons. So Jonathan marked the spot. He took a few stakes from the tractor, drove them into the soil around the nest, and tied the strips of red cloth to each one, a warning to himself, or maybe to whatever else might come looking. When the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, he climbed back onto the tractor. The eggs glowed faintly in the fading light, ghostly and still. As the engine roared to life, he felt the tremor of unease crawl up his spine. He told himself they were harmless, that he'd seen stranger things on this land. But as he drove away, the wind shifted, carrying with it a low sound from the pond, a soft, rhythmic ripple, like something stirring beneath the surface. He paused, listening, but the noise vanished as quickly as it came. That night, as he sat on the porch watching the fireflies rise from the grass, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he had awakened something that had been sleeping for a very long time. And out there, beneath the gnarled stump by the pond, the earth moved. Jonathan woke before dawn, as he always did, but the air felt wrong, heavy, still, as though the world outside his window had forgotten how to breathe. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the ticking of the kitchen clock. He poured his coffee, but the bitter warmth did nothing to quiet the unease coiled in his chest. The image of the leathery eggs wouldn't leave his mind. He had seen them each time he closed his eyes, felt their faint warmth under his fingertips. What kind of creature buried its nest in the shadow of a dead oak? What kind of thing pulsed like that, as though waiting? By the time the sun rose over the horizon, painting the fields gold, he decided to go back. Maybe it was foolish, maybe dangerous, but the pull was stronger than fear. He told himself he was just making sure the nests were undisturbed, that no raccoon or fox had dug them up. Yet, deep down, he already knew this was about something else entirely. The path to the pond was slick with dew, the grass whispering against his boots. When he reached the clearing, the red flags he'd tied the day before fluttered faintly in the breeze. The mound beneath the old stump looked unchanged at first glance, but as he crouched, brushing away the leaves, his heart skipped. The eggs glistened with a faint sheen of moisture, and when his hand hovered close, he felt the unmistakable warmth again, stronger than before. Something inside was alive, growing. He stepped back, his breath catching. The soil around the mound was slightly disturbed, the edges softer than before, as though something beneath had shifted in the night. He scanned the ground for tracks, nothing but faint impressions in the mud, too small for deer, too light for cattle. Something had been here, moving carefully, watching. Jonathan turned toward the pond. The surface was still, but the air carried a faint, rhythmic sound, a slow ripple like a heartbeat beneath the water. It stopped the moment he noticed it. That night, he couldn't sleep. The storm rolled in from the south, thunder low and distant. The farmhouse creaked with every gust of wind, and through the rain, he thought he heard something else. The soft, deliberate scrape of claws on wood, faint but unmistakable. He rose, went to the window, and stared into the darkness. The fields lay quiet, the red flags near the trees barely visible in the flash of lightning. For a moment, just before the thunder rolled again, he thought he saw movement near the pond, a shadow, low and gliding, slipping into the water. He didn't go outside. He just stood there, staring, heart hammering until the storm swallowed the world in noise. The next morning, the air hung thick with humidity and the smell of wet earth. He went into town for supplies, anything to feel normal again. At the hardware store, he ran into Frank Dillard, a retired game warden who'd known his father. They exchanged the usual pleasantries before Jonathan mentioned the strange eggs. Frank's expression changed. "Leathery, you said? Big ones?" His voice was cautious. "Could be turtles or gators. You leave 'em be, son. Best not to poke around on dry ground like that? Jonathan asked. Near the stump? Frank hesitated, eyes narrowing. Sometimes the mothers go inland to lay if the water's been high. Could be nothing. But if it's gators, you'll want to stay clear. They don't take kindly to visitors when nesting. Jonathan nodded, though unease prickled at the back of his neck. There was something in Frank's tone, a trace of something he wasn't saying. By the time he drove back, the clouds were gathering again, thick and gray. The air felt charged. He parked near the barn and decided, against better judgment, to check the clearing once more before the rain hit. The woods were darker this time, the air electric. When he reached the old stump, the sight froze him. The mound had shifted. Several of the eggs bore hairline cracks along their shells, fine and branching like veins. He crouched, breath shallow. When he touched one, it trembled under his fingers. Lightning split the sky. For a heartbeat, the clearing flashed white, and in that moment he saw what lay beyond the first nest. 3 more mounds scattered along the edge of the pond, each marked with faint depressions in the soil, each almost identical. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hissing through the leaves. He stumbled backward toward the tractor, boots sinking in the mud. The air vibrated with thunder, and over the sound, just as he turned to leave, came a noise that didn't belong to the storm. A deep, guttural rumble, low and resonant, rising from somewhere near the water. Jonathan froze, breath caught in his throat. The sound wasn't thunder, it was alive, an animal's warning, primal and ancient. Then came another sound, faint but distinct. A splash. Something massive moving through the pond. He ran. By the time he reached the farmhouse, he was soaked through, shaken. The storm raged on into the night, rain hammering the windows, wind howling through the eaves. But beneath it all, every now and then, he thought he heard the same rumble, distant yet steady, echoing from the direction of the pond. The storm finally passed near dawn, but sleep never came. Jonathan sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the drip of rain from the roof and the steady ticking of the clock. Somewhere beyond the field, the land had changed. Something had claimed it, and deep under the wet earth, the eggs began to move. The morning broke colorless and flat, a bleached Florida sky pressing its weight on the fields. Jonathan stepped onto the porch with his coffee and paused, as if listening for a voice he couldn't name. The silence had changed. It was not the familiar hush of dawn, but a waiting quiet, alert and taut, like a held breath. He'd told himself he wouldn't go back to the nests until someone with authority told him what to do. But as he stood there, the thought of the eggs moving, of something inside them straining toward the light, pulled at him with the insistence of a tide. He left the cup half full on the railing and walked the long path down to the pond. Dew slicked the grass and turned his boots dark. The red flags he had planted fluttered in the light breeze, their motion small and urgent. When he reached the clearing, he could see at once that the earth had shifted. The mound was softened, its edges slumped. A thin, dark seam ran down the center of the nearest shell. He crouched, palms braced on his knees, and watched. The crack widened with a delicate, deliberate motion, and a bead of clear fluid welled up and trembled on the surface before sliding away into the soil. The shell quivered again, then bowed inward, and a wedge-shaped snout, slick and black, pressed through the split. The tiny jaws opened soundlessly, then closed again, testing air for the first time. Jonathan did not speak. Awe and a thin ribbon of dread twined together in his chest. He'd seen calves take their first shaky steps, chicks shiver and blink into existence. This was different. This felt older than the farm, older than the fence line and the white house, and the memory of his father's hands fixing a broken hinge. The little thing pushed forward, forelimbs braced and wriggled free. Mud clung to its scales. A line of wet ridges ran down its back, delicate as embroidery. Its eyes, already open, reflected a shard of pale sky. Then another shell split, and another. Within moments, the mound was alive with movement, small bodies nosing through loosened soil, tiny tails whipping, soft, breathy chirps drifting into the air like a code only the pond could understand. The sound was not frantic. It was a call, and every few seconds the hatchlings paused, heads raised, listening for an answer that had not yet come. Jonathan began to retreat, slowly, carefully, as if backing away from a sleeping fire that might flare with the wrong breath. He had to call someone. Frank. Wildlife control. Anyone. He reached for his phone, then stopped at the first vibration that rippled across the pond. Not wind, not a fish. The surface lifted and lowered like something breathing beneath a blanket. The answer came then. A deep, resonant grunt, almost a purr, thick with promise and warning. It rolled across the water with a weight that struck him more in the bones than in the ear. The hatchlings responded in a chorus of higher notes, and almost as one, they began to orient, toward the sound, toward the water, toward their mother. She rose as if the pond itself assembled into shape. First the eyes, twin beads of amber cut with a dark vertical seam. Then the slope of a broad snout, armored and ancient, surfaced by inches. Water streamed from her brow and poured off in thin veils. She did not rush. She did not need to. Presence alone was the lesson. Jonathan's breath thinned. He stayed low, trying not to look like a thing that stood. The textbooks he'd read as a boy came back in fragments. Don't get between a mother and her young. Don't run. Don't. The big head tilted, and for a second he thought he saw his own shape fixed in that amber gaze, a pale interruption in the green. The grunt came again, lower, a path carved in sound. The hatchlings he had watched emerge now scuttled with surprising purpose, straight toward the water, straight toward her. He might have left then, if not for the one that turned the wrong way. It was no larger than his hand and seemed lost at the edge of the mound, its body caught in a rag of shell, chirping with a higher urgency that pricked something vulnerable in him. It dragged itself forward, limbs splayed, tangled. Jonathan swore under his breath. He knew better. He knew this was none of his business, but he also knew what it felt like to watch something struggle when one small act could ease it. He took one step toward the hatchling. The water erupted. She did not come out of the pond completely. She didn't have to. The head surged forward, jaws opening with a slow inevitability that was somehow worse than speed. She struck the shore, not to bite, but to arrive. The message was so clear it felt like speech. This is mine. Jonathan froze, hand lifted, every line of his body telegraphing, I am not a threat. The hatchling's chirps pitched higher, then reoriented, finding the correct line by sound or instinct. It dragged itself free of the shell strip and turned toward the water. The mother did not move closer, but she did not withdraw. Her eyes held him, minute adjustments of angle tracking his breath, his heartbeat, his mistake. I'm leaving, he whispered. The words were foolish. The intent was not. He backed away, slow as the hour hand, until the distance felt like something he could breathe inside. Only then did she ease back. Not a full retreat, but a settling. Claim reasserted, perimeter redrawn. At the field's edge, he turned and walked without looking back until the red flags were a memory against the trees. His phone shook in his hand, slick with sweat. He called the county number Frank had once written for him on the back of a feed receipt, and when the dispatcher answered, the story spilled out in a steady voice he didn't recognize as his own. Multiple nests, active hatching, adult female present, territory established near livestock and a dwelling. "Stay away from the water," the dispatcher said. "We're sending officers." "Keep everyone off the property. There's no everyone," Jonathan said, and the words felt like an old truth being told again. He spent the next stretch of time, minutes, hours, he couldn't tell, on the porch steps, a coil of lead tightening in his chest. The pasture looked as it always had in the late morning, the grass bright and the breeze lifting pieces of old hay across the dirt like slow birds. The normalcy turned the unease into something sharpened. Nothing obvious had changed, and yet everything had. He saw the truck before he heard it. White sun on a green seal, bouncing down the rutted road between the fence lines. 2 officers climbed out, boots dusted, eyes shaded, movements the calm of people who knew what wild things could do and respected them enough to keep a respectful distance. "You, Jonathan Miller?" the taller one asked. He introduced himself as Cooper, the other as Ruiz. They listened, no interruptions, while Jonathan summarized what he'd seen. They asked the right questions. How many mounds? How close to the house? Any pets? Any cattle still near the water? He gave them the answers as clearly as he could, even the part about the hatchling that had gone the wrong way. Cooper's mouth tightened, not in judgment, but in recognition. "We'll have a look," he said. "You stay back. If you hear us shout, you go inside and close your door." They took poles and markers and moved with patient care through the trees. From the porch, Jonathan watched their progress by the slow rise and fall of the flags they carried. He tried not to imagine their shapes too near the water, the easy line an alligator could cut from shadow to shore. Birds lifted and settled again. Something glinted once. Sun on wet scale or perhaps just on a puddle caught in a rut. When they returned, sweat darkened their collars and forearms. Cooper set 2 marker flags on the porch rail and drew a rough map in dust with the end of his pen. "At least 4 active nests," he said. "Possibly 5 if that debris field near the South Reeds is what I think it is. We saw 2 adult females for sure, likely more. The one you met is guarding the nearest clutch. There's another on the far bank." "And they'll leave?" Jonathan asked, hearing how thin hope sounded when pressed against facts. "Not for a while," Ruiz said, gentle but without varnish. "They're territorial, especially with hatchlings out. You did right to call, but for now, this whole pond and a good portion of your field, that's theirs. We're going to file for relocation, but it's a process. We'll need traps, permits, extra hands." Cooper looked past Jonathan toward the White House and the weathered barn and the stretch of pasture that kept the place from feeling like a memory. "In the meantime," he said, "you stay clear of the water. Move any animals as far off as you can. Keep gates shut. We'll be back with a team." Jonathan nodded, the motion heavy. "It's just me," he said. "The cattle are leased out this season. I can close the barn and the north gate." "Good," Cooper said. "Do that. And if you hear that grunt close, don't go looking. Let them move. They're not interested in you unless you're between them and what they're guarding." After they left, the day brightened as if nothing had been decided. Jonathan walked the pasture lines, latching what needed latching, closing what needed closing. He had done this work 1,000 times, and yet the gates felt different beneath his hands, as if each metal tongue slid into a future that didn't include him. Heat cicadas began their sermon. A red-tailed hawk circled once, twice, then drifted toward the pine ridge. Back on the porch, he found the map Cooper had drawn already blurred by the faint grit of his boots, the edges of each line softening. He hovered his hand over the shape of the pond as if he might feel, through wood and dust, the pulse beneath it. When dusk came, it was swift, a drop of color ringing the horizon and then gone. He stood at the window and watched the field turn the deep, even blue that makes distance impossible to measure. Somewhere near the water, a hatchling squealed, the high, sharp sound that had threaded itself into his sleep the night before, followed by the low, answering grunt that made the glass in the window seem to settle in its frame. He remembered his father standing in that same window, years ago, during a hurricane that had seemed to peel the sky back. "You don't win with water," his father had said, voice steady. "You step aside and let it pass. Then you see what's left to mend." The memory wasn't comfort, but it was a kind of instruction. He turned off the interior lights and let the night claim the house. In the dark, the fields felt nearer, the pond nearer still. He lay down, fully clothed, and didn't close his eyes. He imagined the little bodies moving through the shallows, the mothers circling, the old law of the place spoken with every ripple. Sometime past midnight, a sound drew him up, a scrape across the porch boards, then a clatter that belonged to nothing wild. He went still. After a breath, he recognized it, the screen door shifting in a new wind, tapping against its frame. He exhaled and laughed once, quietly, at his own fear. But when he crossed the floor to secure it, he paused with his hand on the latch. Across the darkness, down near the waterline, a slow shape moved, low and inevitable, a dark triangle where the pond met the land. It paused, angled toward the house as if considering it, then slid soundlessly back into the deeper dark. He closed the screen with care and forced himself to step away. By morning, there were tracks in the soft earth along the fence. Vague, smoothed by a night breeze, but there. Not a threat in themselves, a statement of passage. He knelt and touched one, the ground still cool. It was like pressing a palm to a signature, not written for him, but impossible to miss. He stood, and the decision formed without struggle. The barn would stay shuttered, the work by the pond would stop, and the house would not be the center anymore. The center had shifted to a place he did not own. The day stretched out in a parade of small tasks that only made sense in light of absence. Draining the trough near the lower field, coiling hose he would not uncoil again soon, stacking tools in a neat order as if for a new set of hands. He moved without hurry, honoring the rhythm that had made the farm live. But each finished thing felt like a sentence ending without an invitation to continue. In the afternoon, he heard a truck again, and then two, the engine notes overlapping. He didn't go to meet them at the road. He watched from the porch as Cooper and Ruiz returned with two more officers and a trailer stacked with gear that looked strangely ceremonial. Ropes, poles, weighted floats, heavy plastic carriers. They nodded to him and began their work in silence, the kind of silence professionals carry like a shield. From his distance, the men were arranged on the bank like punctuation marks, each pause and movement significant. Flags sprouted at the water's edge. The radio crackled softly with codes that sounded like weather reports. Twice he saw them halt and pivot, eyes fixed on some disturbance he couldn't see. Twice they resumed, the line inching along the rim of the pond. By dusk, they had done what they could do for a first pass. Cooper climbed the porch steps and took off his hat. "We'll be back at first light," he said. "We've marked 4 nests, maybe 5. At least 2 females holding close. We won't approach them until we've got the full team and permits in hand. Tonight, you keep your doors shut and your porch light off. Fewer reasons for them to come sniffing around." Jonathan nodded. "I hear them," he said simply. Cooper's gaze softened. "I know." He hesitated, then added, "You're doing this right. That matters." When the trucks rolled away, the place settled into the kind of silence that acknowledges company. The pond breathed. The trees listened. And somewhere beyond the arc of his vision, the mothers turned in their dark circle, keeping what was theirs. Jonathan sat alone on the step until the stars came. He listened to the high, thin calls and the replies that traveled through the ground more than the air. The farm's old heart kept its time in him, stubborn and steady. But tonight another rhythm overlaid it, patient and immovable. The first claim had been made, and he understood, with a clarity that made his hands tremble, that everything that followed would be measured against it. The sun rose like a molten coin through the haze, spreading light that didn't feel warm. Jonathan Miller sat at the edge of his porch, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the tree line. The world was still, but it wasn't peace he felt. It was a silence that held its breath between heartbeats, a silence that watched him back. 3 days had passed since the officers first arrived. 3 days of footsteps in mud, of careful voices and clipped radio chatter that never quite reached him. Each morning, their trucks would roll up the drive, the men unloading their gear with the same cautious rhythm. Each evening, they would leave, faces lined with fatigue, their words short, as if the swamp itself might be listening. The farm, once full of motion and sound, now lived in fragments. The barn doors were closed, the fields overgrown with their own rhythm. He no longer heard the creak of the windmill or the chatter of birds nesting in the eaves. Even the insects seemed to hum softer, as though some great presence demanded quiet. He had begun to dream again, dreams that blurred into waking. In them, he stood by the pond beneath the cypress trees, and something beneath the water called to him, not with sound, but with a pulse that throbbed in the soil. When he woke, that same pulse lingered faintly in his fingertips, like an echo left behind. That morning, the officers came again, Cooper in front, Ruiz behind, and 2 new men he didn't recognize. They nodded at Jonathan politely, but none of them smiled. "We're starting the relocation today," Cooper said, adjusting his cap. "The state sent us a crew from the Wildlife Reserve. It'll take time, days, maybe longer. We'll need to block off this side of the property completely." Jonathan's voice came out rough. "You think they'll leave easy?" Cooper didn't answer right away. "They'll fight it," he said at last, "but we'll handle it. We've done this before." Jonathan nodded, though he could see the uncertainty behind the man's eyes. "You'll do what you can," he said quietly. The men moved toward the pond, carrying ropes, poles, and weighted nets. Their boots sank into the soft earth, and the sound of their steps faded into the distance. Jonathan stayed where he was, watching from the porch as their figures blurred into the shimmer of heat. Hours passed. The air grew heavy, buzzing with the promise of rain. Once or twice he heard a shout, a burst of radio static, then silence. The stillness stretched. When the wind finally shifted, it carried a scent that made his stomach turn. Wet mud, algae, and something older. something that smelled like the inside of the earth. Near dusk, Cooper returned, his uniform streaked with dirt and sweat. His face was drawn tight. "How bad?" Jonathan asked. "Worse than we thought," Cooper said, wiping his brow. "There's 4 adult females, all still guarding. We managed to tag 2, but one of the nests, it's bigger than the rest. Must have been here longer. She's not leaving the water. We'll need a crane to move her if it comes to that." "Can't you just let them go?" Cooper looked up sharply. "You'd lose the whole farm," he said. "Once they've claimed territory, they don't stop expanding. They'll take every inch that gives them water and shade." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what the land wants." For a moment, Cooper didn't reply. Then he said, "That may be true, but it's not safe for you." When night fell, the men left their gear by the edge of the field, promising to return at dawn. Jonathan sat alone again, watching the faint lights of their trucks vanish beyond the road. The world seemed to settle around him, thick and quiet. In the distance, the frogs began their chorus, but beneath their croaks was another rhythm, deep, rolling, ancient. He rose and walked toward the pond, drawn by that sound. The moon hung low, a pale shard of bone above the water. The grass was slick with dew, and each step seemed to echo in the stillness. When he reached the clearing, the red flags were gone. The markers had been pulled up or buried in mud. The nests were empty, hollow mounds of crushed shells and dark soil. His breath caught. For a moment, he thought the officers had already moved the hatchlings, but then he saw the ripples. Dozens of them. The pond's surface shimmered faintly, disturbed by movement. Small shapes drifted just below, tiny heads breaking the waterline, eyes like dull coins catching the moonlight. The hatchlings had survived. They were everywhere. And then he saw her. The mother rose from the far side of the pond, her ridged back slicing through the reflection of the moon. The water poured from her in sheets as she emerged halfway from the surface, her body massive, her eyes catching his across the clearing. He didn't move. The stillness between them was alive. He could feel her presence in his chest, in the weight of the air, in the tremor of the ground beneath his boots. She made no sound this time, no growl, no hiss, only watched him, a sentinel between worlds. Jonathan understood then that she was not just defending her young, she was claiming something deeper. The pond, the woods, the soil, it all belonged to her kind long before fences or deeds existed. The land remembered her. He stepped back slowly, whispering words that weren't quite words. "It's yours," he said. "Always was." The alligator blinked once, unhurried, and sank back beneath the water, the surface closing over her like a closing door. When Jonathan returned to the house, dawn was already bleeding into the horizon. The farm was silent again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was full, filled with something vast and unyielding. That day he packed his things, just the essentials, old photographs, a few tools, his father's watch. By the time Cooper's truck appeared at the gate again, Jonathan was standing by the porch, suitcase at his feet. "You're leaving?" Cooper asked, surprised. Jonathan nodded. "You don't have to worry about relocating them anymore," he said. "This land's already been relocated." "It's not mine." Now Cooper studied him for a long moment, then simply said, "You're not wrong." They shook hands, a brief, heavy gesture, and Jonathan walked down the dirt road without looking back. Behind him, the fields shimmered gold under the rising sun, and somewhere in the distance, a low rumble drifted across the water, neither threat nor warning, but something older than both. The land was awake, and it had chosen. By midsummer, the land had grown thick with heat and silence. The once tidy rows of corn were gone, replaced by wild grasses that bent and shimmered under the heavy sun. The fences sagged beneath the weight of creeping vines. The pond lay still, its surface dark and mirror-smooth, reflecting the slow drift of clouds above. Jonathan Miller stood at the edge of the property with a manila folder in his hands, the deed transfer papers. The ink was dry now, the signatures final. The farm he'd worked, fought for, and buried half his life into was no longer his. Miller Creek Farm had become Miller Preserve, a protected wildlife area under the state's care. He had sold it quietly, with no ceremony, no words to mark the end. He had told himself it was the right thing. And it was. But, as he looked across the fields, every shadow seemed to carry a memory. His father's voice calling from the porch, the thrum of the old windmill, the laughter that had once filled these acres when life had seemed endless. A breeze stirred the tall grass, bending it in slow, sweeping waves. Somewhere near the pond, a heron lifted off, its wings catching the sun like silver blades. The sound broke the stillness, and Jonathan smiled faintly. It was a sound of the land breathing again, not as a farm, but as something older, wilder, free. He walked down the path that once led to his fields, now reclaimed by weeds and wildflowers. The air buzzed with dragonflies, the sweet scent of damp soil rising around him. At the edge of the pond, he paused. The water shimmered with a faint green light, alive with small ripples where fish darted beneath the surface. The officers had done their work weeks ago. The alligators, mothers and hatchlings, had been moved to a reserve farther south. Still, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that their presence lingered here, woven into the earth like an old story the land refused to forget. He crouched near the spot where the first nest had been. The soil was soft beneath his fingers, cool and clean. The old stump was gone now, washed away by the rains and time, but he could still see it in his mind. The strange, leathery eggs, the first crack, the flash of movement, the eyes that had met his across the clearing. He didn't fear it any more. What had once been a curse now felt like revelation. The land had shown him what it truly was, not a possession, not a legacy to be guarded, but a living thing, untamed and eternal. When the officials came to post the new sign, he had watched from a distance. Miller Preserve, it read, the words carved deep into oak and sealed with lacquer. Beneath it, a small bronze plaque, in memory of Jonathan Miller, who understood that the land belongs first to nature. He hadn't asked for that inscription. He didn't know who had written it. But when he saw it gleam under the afternoon sun, he felt something in him settle, quiet and certain. Now, as the sky deepened toward dusk, he sat by the water's edge. Fireflies blinked in the reeds, and the first stars pricked the horizon. Somewhere far off, a soft splash rippled through the pond. Small, harmless, but enough to make him glance up. He smiled. Maybe a fish, maybe something else. The land didn't owe him explanations anymore. He leaned back on his elbows, feeling the damp grass under his palms, the steady rhythm of insects all around. The world was alive, indifferent, and beautiful. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about harvests or debts or the weight of family names. He thought only of the stillness, the kind that comes not from emptiness but from acceptance. When darkness finally settled, he rose, brushed the dirt from his jeans, and looked one last time at the pond. The moon floated above it like a silver coin dropped into the world. He whispered, almost without sound, "You can have it now." The wind carried his words across the water, rippling the surface for just a moment before smoothing it again. The farm, the preserve, the wild, it was all the same now. Jonathan turned toward the road, his figure small against the wide, sleeping fields. Behind him, the land lay quiet, patient, eternal. And in that silence it was hard to tell whether the man had left the land or whether the land had finally let him go. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Jonathan's place?